So much. Hello, I'm Silas Ortiz. I use he, they pronouns. I'm a current MSW student in the advanced standing program at University of Michigan. My current focus is the policy and political pathway, and I'm the current NSW Michigan education intern. Uh, as Danielle said, this is going to be a webinar series. It's the first in the series. Just a little information. So it'll be the second Friday of every other month. So the next webinar would be May 10th, and that one will be focused on election laws and deadlines. But we do have other events. So the next event after this will be Capital Action Day on March 21st in Lansing from 9 to 3. You can find out more information on the MSW Michigan community calendar. A lot of great things will be happening. So now I want to introduce our panelists to talk about this topic of moving macro to the forefront. So first, we have Justin Hodge, who is a clinical associate professor of social work at the University of Michigan. He's the co-lead for the policy and political social work pathway. Hodge is also the current chair of the Washtenaw County Board of Commissioners, who just Wednesday had a social work proclamation. So very thankful for that. Hodge is on the national level, he serves as the board president of the Congressional Research Institute for Social Work and Policy, which is CRISP, which is also happening next week. So very busy during this time of March. And it works to expand the participation of social workers in the federal legislative and policy processes. He's also a founding board member of the Social Work Democracy Project, a charitable organization focused on providing resources to schools of social work to advance knowledge of government and democracy. Joining us, we also have Dr. Terri Friedline, who writes and organizes and teaches about racial capitalism, technology, and the financial system. She's an associate professor of social work at the University of Michigan and is the author of Banking on a Revolution, Why Financial Technology Won't Save a Broken System. Friedline is active in policy. She has served as a member of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau's Academic Research Council and has volunteered on the Economic Policy Council of a presidential campaign has been endorsed by the Progressive Talent Pipeline. If either of you guys want to go into like further introductions, please feel free.
I can go ahead and start. Good morning, everybody. Thank you all for being here. It looks like we've got a great turnout. I think the introduction was thorough. I appreciate it, Silas. Just looking forward to having a great conversation here.
Yeah, similarly, it's great to be here with everyone and to talk about macro practice. And happy to be in conversation with Justin and with Silas and with all of you.
Thank you very much. So we're going to start with just like kind of a simple question, like what is macro social work and why is it important? So we can start with Justin. But where did you start in social work?
Yeah, I actually started my social work career doing clinical practice. So before I got my MSW, I was doing paraprofessional work at the community mental health that serves the Ingham, Eden, Clinton, Tri-County areas. And from there, I was really interested in pursuing a career in clinical social work. So after I got my MSW, and during my time in my MSW program, I began to get more interested in policy and more macro social work, but still was really focused on becoming a clinician. So I graduated from the MSW program and then continued working at community mental health. And I worked there for a number of years doing a wide variety of different jobs. I did case management for kids and adults with developmental disabilities. I did home-based child and family therapy, and then eventually moved into doing mostly crisis intervention work with suicidal teens. And I was working at CMH during the time when Governor Snyder and the legislature dramatically cut the budgets to the CMH system, which resulted in social workers across the state having to discharge a lot of clients, often without a really clear transition plan. And it was that experience that really got me more focused on wanting to engage in policy and political work, because when you look at the people that tend to be in positions of power and that are making decisions that are hugely consequential for the most vulnerable in our communities, it tends not to be social workers, which is something that we're all working to change. But particularly back then, it tended not to be social workers. So for me, that was really the thing that got me to get more focused on getting involved. And then from there, I continued doing clinical social work for a while, but also worked to get appointed to different local boards and commissions to start building up some policy experience there. Eventually moved into doing work in academia, teaching, and then eventually moving into full-time, making that my full-time job. And I ran for Washtenaw County Commissioner and was elected in 2020, and it's been a wild ride since then.
Dr. Friedland, if you want to talk about I think in the macro field, but a very different route, I think, as a researcher, if you'd like to talk about that, that'd be great.
Yeah, thanks. One of the things that I want to say is that we know that macro practice is like pretty broad and spans a lot of different like industries and like job responsibilities. So management and supervisory roles, community organizing, policy advocacy, all of that, is encompassed under the umbrella of macro practice. And I'm interested in a type of social work that pulls up social injustices at the root and like works on building new things together with other people. And so happy Social Work Month, but also happy Women's Month and International Women's Day. And, want to point to like Ella Baker, a leader in the civil rights movement, who talked about understanding and getting to the root cause of things. And Angela Davis, abolitionist and communist, who talked about, something radical being that all that is simply pulling something up by the root. And so this is some of my inspiration for a social work practice at the macro level that's thinking about root causes and systems of power and oppression, and how we in our practice can really target those underlying issues specifically. And maybe much like Justin, I started my career in clinical practice. So I was a clinical social worker, a therapist for individual groups and families at a residential treatment facility in Pennsylvania. So I did that for a number of years and had my advanced clinical license. And so one of the parts of my job responsibilities, which was a requirement by state law at the time, was to make sure that young people who were leaving residential treatment facilities received independent living skills. So they had to learn about budgeting and how to rent an apartment and lots of different things that had to do with money and finances, which is a lot of what my research and policy work focuses on now, is around money and finances and banking. And realized that there was just like an incredible number of barriers like stacked up against young people who were, after having lived in this treatment facility for a pretty good portion of their lives, now moving out and having to figure out how to do these things on their own with a system that is really set up to like further exploit and marginalize them. Charge them high interest rates on credit cards or overdraft fees, things like that in the banking system. And I think it's pretty common to have a path that moves back and forth between clinical and macro, because that practice and those skills are along a continuum. So I think like most MSW students who have been in a clinical track after a year in their new job, at least over half have some macro level responsibilities. So there's a lot of macro that's already at the forefront of social work practice. And so when I realized these things about young people's experiences, that led to my research career and where my research work and policy work focuses now.
Thank you very much. I will go back to you again, Dr. Freeland. If you could you maybe discuss some of the challenges you faced, or like maybe even some of the fears you had moving into like trying to find out these root causes, and maybe even day-to-day struggles you find with connecting your research of like what are the root causes to maybe when it comes to actual practice as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the challenges, so one of the first things that I did in terms of like engaged policy work was work at think tanks in Washington, D.C. and engage with policymakers and staffers on Capitol Hill. And I mean, I think the challenge is really the like socioeconomic class kind of structure sometimes of policymaking, that like I grew up in a family that was like poor and rural and like not involved in large scale politics at all. And so there was a lot of that environment that I thought was about me, that I wasn't, understanding sort of the process, right. But the longer I did that work, I realized, this is an ecosystem, like a policymaking ecosystem that I can understand. And, there are lots of folks here from Ivy League places, and they're using vocabulary and language and expectations that I don't understand. And so that was like an early challenge, that once I realized kind of what the challenge was, and that there were some structural things associated with that, that became a little bit easier for me to navigate. I think it's also been hard for me to figure out, when is a reform a change that is shaping the underlying like structure of a system. So when is maybe a small incremental change? When is that just a simple reform that further entrenches power and oppression? Or when is that change moving us, shifting us towards something that is more just, and creates new openings and possibilities? I think sometimes that's hard to see when you're proposing something new. Like there was a new initiative maybe almost 2 decades ago now to encourage banks to offer free checking accounts. Seems like a simple thing, a free checking account, no expensive overdraft fees, no exorbitant minimum balance fees. And so there was a policy created to encourage banks to do that. We're 20 years in, and that program hasn't really grown all that much, but banks are really involved now in trying to figure out the solution, even though that they have also been a part of creating that problem. So in my mind, that is kind of like a reform that hasn't really like shifted some of the underlying root causes. Though we could have a policy that just made a low, no-cost checking account that would, I think, elicit some of that shift, like already exists in Canada or other places, have policies like that. So I think figuring out where to invest your time and what sorts of changes you're moving toward have been a challenge as well.
Thank you very much. I would also pose the same question to you, Justin.
The question was about root causes and challenges facing that.
Well, yeah, and also like the challenges you face as moving into the macro field.
Yeah, I mean, I would say whenever we're trying to address root cause challenges and make huge system change in social work, we're really facing like backwards momentum. And we talk about this frequently in class, and you and I have talked about this. And then when you're trying to move forward any kind of change, whether it's progressive change or something else, the system is already set up. Many systems are already set up in a way and have built upon itself over hundreds of years potentially. And to try to make any kind of change, you're fighting inertia. And it's tough to keep people galvanized around efforts like that when you're not necessarily seeing the quick kind of successes that many people would want to see to stay encouraged and to stay in the fight. And when you get discouraged and you don't engage anymore, you're definitely not going to see any successes. So part of that is keeping people interested and wanting to stay engaged and trying to do that kind of work, and recognizing that you're not always going to get the huge big win you want to get right away. That's why sometimes when we look at national politics or even state and local politics, sometimes the changes that people are looking for, maybe it's a small change, but it could have taken years to get there, and it's still worth celebrating. And those are the things that we really do need to celebrate and help with educating people around. Policy change is hard because it's not just one thing affects all of these other things. So if we try to make one kind of change, you have to think about the unintended consequences of that. And more broadly, when you make this one kind of change, what are the ripple effects going to be in other spaces? I think a lot of what Terri has talked about around financial social work and trying to make changes in those ways is really important. Also, something really important to me too, more at the county level and work that I've tried to do there around trying to encourage low to no cost checking and savings accounts, because that's a really critical issue for people in Washtenaw County and across the state of Michigan. People really get wrapped up in making use of predatory lending agencies, and we don't really have good laws in Michigan that prevent that kind of thing. There is a bill in the legislature that would effectively, I think, end predatory lending in Michigan if it were to pass. But so those are some of the kinds of like basic needs that if you're not engaged in our financial system with basic things like having a savings or a checking account, it just impacts your life in many other ways that can be really challenging. And so we're thinking about how do we like challenges moving into macro social work. Frequently, what I hear from students that are on the like one of our micro tracks, they say, "Well, I don't know if I should take that class because I don't have any experience with X, Y, and Z." And I mean, really, that's not the point. Like you get a social work education because you get a well-rounded education in a wide variety of different domains of practice. So I think some of that is helping people feel like they have the internal efficacy to be able to do the work, not doubt themselves, and not create additional barriers for them to get into the work. And I know it comes up later. We're going to talk about ethics later, but we do have an ethical obligation to engage in social and political action to advance social justice. All social workers do, including our clinical social work friends that are in private practice. So finding ways to help people see that the macro work isn't something that's like far off out there, but it's something that they could be doing and is really connected to their work. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you guys both touch on like that, kind of without saying it, the imposter syndrome of moving into the macro field. Because I think I've experienced as a college student is feeling like the world's too big, and macro field's almost too big to there's so many challenges and they all affect each other differently. How we can overcome them. But I think you guys made a very good point of like how you guys yourselves have had experience in the micro field that really informed your decisions and your knowledge to be able to be in the macro field and do work effectively. So next, I want to move into um, about how politics and public policy really affects our work as social workers. So I know Justin, you kind of talked about it earlier with Governor Snyder and how it affected your work at CMH. But if you could, expand on that, even talk about currently as a commissioner, as a social worker, how that current policy affects you.
Well, I mean, I say all policy is going to affect social workers because we have an interest inherently in social change and social justice. And the way that we've decided to run our society is through having a representative democracy and electing people to make policy decisions. And those policy decisions impact all of us, all social workers. I always like to try to zero in on what really affects clinical social workers since they make up the majority of the professionals in our field. But if you think about insurance reimbursement rates, and the work that NASW is doing to try to increase those. So social workers are paid more, which is one of the themes of Social Work Month this year. That's really important. So knowing what associations that are working on our behalf related to policy, we need all of our social workers engaged in that. Determining what kinds of services are able to be provided, that's another thing that's going to impact social workers directly, since so many of us are in the field providing direct care to people. So if you think about the money behind it, policy around what services can be provided, and just the general landscape of what impacts people on their day-to-day lives, and us as social workers having an interest in promoting social justice and increasing people's welfare, that is all things that we really need to be paying attention to. So what I would like to see is for us to have all social workers having a good understanding, at least a baseline understanding of what's going on politically and from a policy perspective in their local community. I think frequently people get really focused on what's going on nationally, which is important. National government is very important, and the federal government does important things from time to time when they can get something passed. But the things that I always say, the magic happens at local and county government and state government too. But the things that are happening there are really what affects you on a day-to-day. The example that I always like to think back to, because it's one of the ones that was more formative for me after I got elected. So I started my campaign for in 2020, launched in Social Work Month, as I typically like to do my campaign kickoffs in Social Work Month. But people think back to 2020, something else that happened in March that year was COVID really exploding and becoming the global pandemic that we all know it to be now. And so having to campaign during that period and then finding a way to win, then coming into office at the beginning of 2021, I was actually sworn into office on Insurrection Day, which was wild. But then the first thing that we're really focused on is how do we make sure that we're getting PPE and vaccines to people as they became more widely available. So figuring out from how do we use government and focus from an equity perspective to make sure that we're getting vaccinations to the most vulnerable in the community, which are often probably communities that have the least trust in government. So these are all things that bringing a social work perspective to was really important as we came up with strategies to make sure that we were supporting all of our community members, particularly the ones that were most vulnerable.
Thank you. And Dr. Friedline, I would like to ask you the same question of how the current politics and public policy around local, state, and federal level have affected you as a social worker and your all your actions as a social worker.
Well, I'll say, I mean, I agree a lot with Justin in that, you know, all policy is going to affect us in some way, either us as individuals, the communities that we live in, the people that we love. And so in terms of, well, one thing that I wanted to think of is like, I think there is kind of, you know, the possibility of having an imposter syndrome and like entering into these macro spaces as we've mentioned earlier. And also I think sometimes the systems and the spaces, it's not necessarily that an individual is an imposter, but it's like what has been sort of set up around us to exclude, right, perspectives and experiences and marginalize people out of those spaces. So like the system, I think, should be like also part of the imposter. And I mean, in terms of like policy and how I'm affected and how that connects to my work, one of the things that I think research can do really well is like span the scale between the individual and the system. And so, you know, thinking across like our clinical or our micro to macro sort of continuum of our practice. One of the reasons that we can work with individuals is to have a, you know, sort of precise understanding about the ways that systems are working in people's lives and to be able to speak back to those systems. And so, and I think also, as Justin mentioned, there are ways to do that, you know, at local, state, and federal levels across the scales of our policymaking. So I'm going to give an example from banking, I guess because that's sort of where my work is and where the examples seem to come most readily for me. The state of California is, you know, considering legislation that would make a free online bank account available for everyone, that would protect people's privacy. If they, you know, if they wanted to manage their money in this sort of way, they wouldn't have to worry about a $35 overdraft fee for a $4 cup of coffee. And they wouldn't have to like pay out a portion of their, you know, of their state benefits or their welfare benefits to ATM withdrawals or anything like that. It would be a way, an online way with the ATMs to be able to make, you know, to be able to make that money management possible for people who are like pushed out of the banking system in a lot of ways. And so it would be available to folks who are undocumented without sort of the same surveillance that banks maybe have for folks who are undocumented. And this legislation developed in part because of the stories that individual people were telling about their experiences with banks and communities that could funnel that work up to advocacy organizations that included social workers in those spaces. And could propose a policy then at the state level that would, you know, work to make something like this a reality and remove a barrier to people being able to use their own money in their lives for the things that they want and need. And so, yeah, I don't know if that directly speaks to, you know, how I am, you know, impacted by these policies, but I think that an issue like that, like scales different sort of policy ecosystems, also different, you know, experiences that people have with discrimination in banking. I mean, connects a topic like economic justice to immigration, to, you know, racist sexism in the banking system. And as a policy that is maybe beginning to chip at some of the root causes.
Yeah, I think you get a lot of good stuff and like a lot of a way to connect us to what I was going to talk about next is like more specific policies that have come up in like obviously in Michigan, a big thing that NASW's been pushing for is the Social Work Modernization Act and changes licensure. But also you talk about big topics that say the union was last night. What was talked about. Uh, we talk about like immigration and how I think ethically, a lot of we talk about how it can be hard for us to maybe think about a social worker, like how we interact with immigration policy, but knowing that we have the ethics of the value and dignity and self-worth of a person, but we can also connect that with the LGBTQ plus community and the constant fight on every that's currently going on in every state. In my home state in Ohio, there's a lot of bad policy that's hurtful that's going on, and also reproductive freedom. So if either of you guys want to talk about currently like more specific policies and how we can see that we just as you said, a lot of I think current wins that were talked about the state association with NASW earlier this week, a lot of wins in Michigan going on this policy, but how we can balance that these wins also continuing the fight federally and help even if we move in other states or like we know macro social workers in other states as well.
Well, I would just say a few things about licensure, since that's probably a topic of interest to this NASW crowd, and jump into Silas if you want to add more to it. But I would say that I think the changes to licensure would be really fantastic, particularly because of the challenges we've had in Michigan around field sites for students that are not in a interpersonal practice focused field placement. I mean, personally, a lot of the work that I've tried to do at the school is be able to expand the number of macro field placements that we've had, and it's tough to do that with the supervision requirements and not having social workers in many of those spaces, or possibly having a social worker in one of those spaces, but they're not licensed, because there's been little incentive for a macro focused social worker to get licensed in Michigan, outside of really thinking about besides having the credential and being able to say that you have your license. Really the only other major perks you get are being able to take field students, depending on whatever the policies at the institution are, and so being a field site. But having this, I think the changes that are going to come up with licensure would make it a lot easier for a lot of currently practicing macro social workers to get licensed and then be more engaged with students, which I think would be really fantastic, because it would open up our students across Michigan to be able to engage with more professional social workers, many that they probably wouldn't have engaged with otherwise. I think that would open up what students see as possibilities for different career paths. Because as I continue to do work, like in my capacity as a county commissioner and learning about social workers in a lot of different policy spaces, I'm finding a lot more MSWs in spaces that I didn't know there was an MSW there, but they don't think of themselves as doing social work, or they don't identify themselves as a social worker. And I'm hoping a lot of that will change. And it'll make it easier too for people to see, oh, social work is more than just this, and this. It's all of these other things, because we'll have more professionals and more spaces that are licensed and that are putting their social work identity more forward, and then students will see that and be able to engage with them. I know there's other things related to licensure and in the Modernization Act. I don't know if you want to talk more about that.
Well, yeah, I think something that maybe Dr. Friedland could talk about a little bit is there's a lot of talk about with racial banking. There is a racial gap, I would say, with the exam, and Modernization Act is working on mainly just focusing on the supervision hours to get licensed, rather than focusing on this exam that we know with statistics that have come out has racist, and you see that our social workers of color statistically do worse on this exam, even though if they have a lot of experience in the field. And I think even as a student of the University of Michigan who's in field, I can tell you as a macro student, it was very hard to find very limited macro practices that you could find in field. So I think that's another big point that you make, that we could expand how many students are active and get to the macro field quicker and feel more confident in it if we have a bigger and robust number of macro field sites, because as you said, there's social workers everywhere. Sometimes it's just hard to find them, and hopefully these actions will help build that coalition where people are like, yes, I'm a macro social worker, I'm a political social worker as well. But I do want to open the field to Dr. Friedland of like, if you have any, because I know at taking some of your classes as well, hearing about like, racial divide, if you could maybe talk to that about that at all, if you feel comfortable within the exam part.
Yeah, thanks for your question, Silas. And I'll say, I mean, I really want to applaud Justin's work in making macro placements available and his championing that issue. And that has been like critical work, not only at our school, but across the state. And so to make sure that people not only know that macro is a realistic possibility, but also to have places where they can study and learn how to do that work is really important and appreciated. In terms of the Modernization Act and the exam, I maybe am not going to be able to speak into too much detail. But one of the questions in the or comments in the chat is about professionalization, and we're a field, a profession that has been pretty prominently dominated just percentage wise by white women over time. There's been a interest in both lifting up social work as having value and finding ways to do that. And so licensure and professionalization and clinical practice has, one of the ideas is that professionalization and licensure has been a way to do that. And so, I mean, my understanding of the exams is they have been, developed by the ASWB, sort of, both in terms of like standardized testing that is commonly found across other places like the SAT and the GRE, to have racially disparate outcomes. And so to also see that in a social work licensure exam, maybe we would anticipate that based on what we see in other sorts of like tests in that regard. And then how we educate students, the sorts of implicit and explicit curriculum that we have in our social work classes. I don't know if I'm going to be able to speak directly to all the details, Silas, to the exam, but I can imagine that like the way that we train up and prepare people, that we could do better in that regard.
Yeah, I can
in
hop in
addressing
real quick.
those outcomes. Yeah.
Because I think you can make some good points. 'Cause remember, one of my classes was Justin. We talked about who writes questions for the exams, and I think you make a good point of like social work has been historically a field dominated by white women, and if we have professionals writing these questions,
that white girl got real income.
It's mainly going to be white women writing these questions, and it's mainly I think from my experience, it comes from implicit bias of this is like it's not purposely singling out and like targeting people of color, but it's just that implicit bias of like their experience and not maybe not having a full robust understanding of maybe people of color and social workers of color of how their experience is different, because social science isn't it's different in every social work is different in every case. It's case by case scenario every single time, so it's hard to create a perfect science. But I think you make a good point when you talk about it being a historically dominated by white women, and how that can create implicit biases can really affect these questions. I do want to kind of also mention again the current policies that we see dominate the state, local, even, and obviously the federal level of talking about you see a lot of attacks on trans affirming care and young trans people. We see a lot of attacks on, as we see we saw in Alabama a couple of weeks ago with IVF, and I mentioned reproductive freedom was talked about a lot recently. Last night at the State of the Union, and immigration keeps it a hot topic. I do want to mention how, and as we lead into talking about the code of ethics, how we talk about self-determination and the self and dignity, the worth dignity of a person, how social workers are implored to work on these policies, whether we may know a lot about them, but to be active and fighting for what our code of ethics say. So I'll turn it over to Justin if you want to talk about how, because you talked about a little bit earlier about how we are implored to be politically engaged. Now, other parts of the code of ethics can help lead us into what policies we fight for and where we stand on history.
Yeah, I mean, the challenge with any kind of code of ethics is it can't tell you exactly what to do and when to do it or how to do it. But our code of ethics is really clear about us having an ethical obligation to engage in social and political action that advances social justice and equity and to support marginalized communities. And I think that's something really critical for all social workers to be aware of. I mean, it's a relatively new addition. I mean, it's not new anymore, but in terms of like, it's not old. It's not a super old addition to the code of ethics. But that requirement is also true for practicing clinical social workers too. So you don't get out of it by not doing macro work. You still have that ethical obligation to be engaging in that kind of practice. And whether that shows up in the kind of clinical practice that's being done or something outside of the clinical space is just something that clinical social workers should be thinking about. There's another piece in the code of ethics that talks about we should, as social workers, provide some amount of pro bono service. So what I always say to clinical social workers or students that want to be clinical social workers and are thinking about, well, how am I going to do work that advances social justice when I'm going to be mostly in an office doing interpersonal work? I would say that there are a wide variety of ways to be politically engaged and think about finding what works best for you and have that be that pro bono service that we're all obligated to also provide. And that could look like doing voter registration work or doing voter education work, or working to make sure that your clients are aware of policies that impact their care. I mean, all those are things that are really critical and I don't think are too much of a leap away from, we would never ask someone to do something that they don't feel competent in doing. I mean, it's also within our code of ethics that we perform our practice in a way that is competent. So there's not this ask that people go and do things that they're not trained to do specifically. But what I would say is that the work that can be done in the policy and the political space is so broad, there is something for everyone in there. And I would say, I think that the floor for that would be doing voter registration. Michigan has, I think, really good voter registration laws that allows people to support really anybody in getting registered to vote. There are some states where you have to go through specific training to get a certification to be able to do that. And that's clearly put in place to be a barrier. Texas is one of those places, clearly a barrier put in place to prevent voter registration and particular communities from getting registered to vote. But that's not how it is here. Another thing that clinical social workers or anybody really can think about is supporting the running of elections. So, when you go in to vote, there are all the people there that help you, like check you in, give you the ballot and all that. Those are really critical roles. And if we look back at a couple of election cycles ago, when the former president was really attacking democracy and attacking election workers, and there was a whole, force trying to do that, that really highlighted how important it is that you have people that are working at elections. And that's something that everybody on this call can, well, not everybody on the call can do. You can't do that if you're an elected official or a family member of an elected official. So I can't do it. So somebody do it in the audience for me, because I'd really like to be able to do the poll working thing at some point, but it's not happening for me right now. But my point is there's something for everybody to do in that space. So it's important to just figure out what that is and what fits best for you.
Thank you so much. And also, slight little plug, we'll talk more about how to be a poll worker and like a lot of election laws and deadlines in May. So definitely come back to learn more about how Justin just said to be a poll worker and be, involved. And I think as you say, like, when we think about macro social work and policy and political, most people don't think about being a poll worker as the first thing, but it's a very important part. Also, want to ask you, Dr. Friedline, as a researcher and a professor, I think it's simple for us to, kind of imagine how, Commissioner Hodge is active in policy and politics, as he has a board meeting twice a month and, has a lot of roles as a public official. But I wonder how you yourself find yourself being politically engaged through research and also being a professor and just being as a social worker in regular everyday life.
Yeah, thanks. And in terms of like an easy way to get into some sort of macro practice or advocacy. I also want to put in a plug for like writing public comments. I think that that's another maybe easy entree into knowing about a policy and writing a letter and sending it off. At sort of any level of policymaking. A really thoughtful, and I don't mean thoughtful in terms of you have to have all the grammar right or you have to know all of the details about the issue, but I think, really meaningful, thoughtful public comment letters can shape public policy, and they do at least in some of the consumer financial protection laws and regulations have been able to shape policy in that arena. And that's part of, I guess, how I work or incorporate policy into my work and policy advocacy. One of the things that I do that maybe is a little bit more kind of tangible, it is that I was a member of the Academic Research Council at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. So that meant regular sort of quarterly meetings to read about the rulemaking that the Bureau was considering and, provide comment and feedback, from a research position on how the Bureau might move forward with its rulemaking, or read some of the research reports that the Bureau was producing before they sort of move forward to publication. So, can we do a little bit of peer review of the research that the Bureau is producing? But I also write and have written public comments. I will consult, just as part of my work or pro bono with folks who are pursuing like policy in their local elections. So I talked with somebody who's running for a policy position in his local community in Alabama a couple weeks ago about what could he do around credit scores? How could he write some sort of resolution or regulation to make it part of his platform? I read and comment on the reports that advocacy organizations are producing about banking and finance related recommendations that they have. And so, how do these recommendations look from a research standpoint? What evidence can we use in advocating for this particular policy? And so, and of course, I think also in my classes, I also want students to be excited, even if they don't envision themselves moving directly into a macro practice position, or think that it's part of work that they want to engage in, for a substantial amount of their time in the future. I want them to be excited about work. I want them to be able to, see macro practice as being an important area of social work, and that if they choose that they can be involved, in the future, they can see the relevance of policymaking for their practice, whether that's, working with individual clients or in grassroots organizing, or in like a macro practice sort of setting.
Thank you very much. I do want
to
to
add really quickly to what Terri said about public comment and how critical that is as a person that frequently receives public comment. It is very useful. And so in addition to doing written public comment, think about going and to your local government and providing verbal public comment too. You still probably write it down so you can hit the time limit. But your local elected officials want to hear from you about issues. I had about 3 hours of public comment at my Board of Commissioners meeting this last Wednesday. And it was all about the same thing for the most part. So that's so that really sends a message, right? When you have that number of community members come out to talk about a very specific thing, that is a way that really anybody can be involved in influencing policy, where you go and directly engage with elected officials there. I mean, so written public comment, definitely do that. Also consider going, and also it's a good opportunity for you to see the kinds of things that are happening at those other levels of government that people don't always think about, but that do impact your day-to-day life. So like if you're driving around the Ann Arbor area or really anywhere else, and there's a bunch of no turn on reds and you don't like those, or there's a bunch of one-way streets and you don't like those, somebody made that decision, or some government body did, so you probably engage with them about that.
Thank you very much. I think what you guys both kind of mentioned directly and indirectly is like the competency in the code of ethics And I think one thing that you guys both did in your stories is you took what you knew as clinical social workers and as social workers, and you directly related to what you're doing when you moved into the macro field. I think it's important, just like as you said, Justin, like as social workers, we all have, we're experts at something. We have knowledge of something from the work we do, and we can see directly if we're in the macro, in the micro field. We can see directly how these policies can affect real people, and we can, through public comment, through joining commissions, through going your route and actually running for political office, we can make those changes. I think another through some of the comments talk about, if we want to gain competency, is there's a lot of ways to do that. Either just, I think myself going to some of your board meetings, I'm able to learn about some of the issues as being a new resident of Washtenaw County this year, learning of the policies and the politics going on in Washtenaw County by going. But also there's a bunch of opportunities with NASW. I know someone mentioned the social justice and racial equity committee for NASW. We have the legislative and social policy committee. There's also MPACE, which if you're interested on another side thing, they are looking for more community members. So that's always a thing. If you are interested, go to their meetings. It's about, I believe, once a month. You can learn more and maybe eventually be on the committee to talk about how's NASW pushing, what policies are we pushing, what are we doing. I think another thing I feel like, be remiss to not talk about. So, the Michigan primary was just the other day, and we saw a large group, even Michigan social workers for Palestine were a very big part of this, of the uncommitted campaign. And the reality, all that political action took was going to the polls and filling in a bubble and turning it in. So I think as you guys talk, there's a big picture of like, we talk about imposter syndrome, or even like, the system creating that imposter syndrome. Sometimes it's helps to think of like, all these actions are not too big for us. Writing public comment, going to your meeting, whether a lot of I know Washtenaw County, and I'm not sure about all governments, but I assume they do have Zoom options where you can do it through. You can give public comment through Zoom. I know you can also write public comment and send it in. So these are all options that it's usually not. You don't have to be the person carrying the banner walking through the streets. You can being another number of the 100,000+ that even voted uncommitted, that's a very big political action that is very important to greater movements that we see. And also, let's see someone else plugging the League of Women Voters, which I also is very important.
May I build on some of that, Silas?
Yes, please.
So I was also thinking about like the role of failure. Like sometimes I have failed, or like not, I have learned through this process, and failure, depending on, the context in which you're working and, sort of what you're advocating for, what's happening. I mean, the consequences of failure maybe are like different based on racism and sexism and classism, of what you might be doing in a given moment and what's happening. But when I look back on some of the things that I've done, I think I wish I would have done that differently, or I didn't do that right, or I wish I would have organized with other people and not felt so alone in this. So like you just mentioned, you don't have to be the one holding the banner. If you're advocating for something, it helps to be connected with a group, maybe like the League of Women Voters or other organizing efforts, so that if you're learning, the successes and the failures aren't solely your own, that you're connected with a group of people too, working on an issue.
I'd just say failure too doesn't necessarily have to be, something to be too averse from. Like I like what Terri said, like be part of a group and be able to get experience that way too. But don't let failure be like a thing that keeps you away from trying to do certain things. Because I always say you learn more from a loss than you do from a win. And I've run for office a couple of times and lost, then eventually I won, and then won again, and I'm hoping to win again this year. But I learned a lot the times that I lost, and I don't think I would have won when I did had I not lost the other times. So thinking about all of that, like connecting with other organizations, so you don't feel like it's all on you, but also if you do engage in some activities where it is more on you, it's okay. You'll learn something. You pick yourself up, take a little break afterwards, but then pick yourself up and try again.
I think that's a very important thing, 'cause even myself as a young student, and that's been involved in advocacy most of my life. I feel like I uh, failed a lot in advocacy. If I look at, there's a lot of things that I didn't want to pass that passed, that I was, advocating against. But I think there's also roles of, as you said, like in failure, there's other people that can fail with you, and you can use that time, as someone says, in the chat, opportunity for growth and learning. We can, learn about what could we have done better, how can we grow, and social justice isn't it's not linear, and it's not a one-time thing. It's a constant fight. You know, we'd like it to be a nice big win and it's over, and we're can all live nice happy life in Candyland, but it's not the reality of the world. It's a constant fight, and then we're all a part of it. So we're constantly failing and winning and learning how to for that next fight. There's another important comment in the chat that I do want to bring up that I think is very interesting. One of our guests makes a comment about how they're not sure if the 2-year clinical MSW programs always provide enough time for students to buy in on this obligation of advocacy and justice. So I wonder, as professors, like, how do you, especially with a lot of advanced standing students at U of M, how do you try to instill this obligation and like the want to fight for advocacy and social justice when you may only have students for such a short amount of time?
I think that's a tough one to Susan's point, because there's such variability across different MSW programs, and we have to meet the Council on Social Work Education's requirements to be accredited. But frequently what that results in is, I think, some schools of social work not putting as much emphasis or providing as many opportunities and certain what we call pathways at our School of Social Work as others, and then they become very clinical focused. So speaking from me and Terry's program here, we have the set of courses that all students have to take, which help meet the certain set of competencies that all students will have to meet by the time they graduate. But then there's a lot of choice within that for students to pick whatever pathway, or that's our term for concentrations, that students want. So like we have a policy and political social work pathway, or management and leadership, and program evaluation and applied research, and several other ones. So that was us, I think, as we designed this new curriculum, trying to put effort into allowing more choice by students so they could focus and build skills outside of that. And then advanced standing is different, since we do teach this pretty hard in BSW programs. Right. So then in our case, like, we get an advanced standing student, they get to leap over all that essentials content is what we call it, but then jump right into the pathway content. So I think some of that is tough in that, how do you infuse the advocacy and the interest in more macro and policy work and courses that all students have to take. And I think there's always been a tension in our curriculum around that. And then the other part is, how do you get certain credits allocated away from clinical work for programs that are much more clinical focused? I don't know, Terry, you want to add any to that?
Yeah, I was thinking, I guess that we need this to be, a very front and center professional commitment then, because as educators, we might only have, a year's time or maybe 2 years' time for students in an MSW program. That, the BSW program then is really important, and like continuing to infuse and opportunities for professional development after educational programs, that hopefully this remains part of a broader professional commitment, that a BSW or an MSW degree isn't the only place where we have opportunities to learn and to be involved. And I think there are some really great social work organizations. I'm thinking of the Michigan Welfare Rights Organization, part of the Poor People's Campaign, Social Workers for Palestine is organizing. And so I think there are professional or maybe not professional, but there are organizing efforts. There's a Social Workers for Radical Action group that is a national group that organizes around critical policy issues. And so there are places that exist where we can be connected to organizing, and not just for our professional licensure, but organizing and active around like issues of real policy concern. And so hopefully an MSW or VSW program will provide opportunities to make those connections, but that we also have them across our careers.
Thank you very much. I think also, as Susan says, of helping practitioners, helping our colleagues understand this importance of this. I myself, I wrote last semester about how I think social work has kind of become split and more micronized as social work has developed throughout history, and we've kind of lost the focus of macro. I think part of it is just like common advocacy. It's a very important advocacy point when we talk about CSWE, NASW, ASWB, all these things of like bringing, as we're doing today, bringing macro back to the forefront of how are we making sure all these students, whether clinical macro, anywhere in between, understand the importance of political action, and that, all these things are connected from micro level to macro level, and within the meso as well. How do we make sure, change doesn't happen just in one sector? If we want change, social justice happens in all places, and hopefully all at once, so you can see actual change. So I think it's very important of like a very real thing of an advocacy point that kind of gets maybe glossed over, but it's very important to like continue of like, how do we get the future practitioners, myself included, ready for the macro world, whether we're in the clinical space and just wanting to do our part, or if we want to spend our whole career in this field. And kind of building off of that, one thing I know myself this semester I've struggled with is, and I don't think a lot of people think when we think of social justice and thinking about root causes, and even at University of Michigan School of Social Work, we talk about these grand challenges of we know like what the root problems are, we know what the end goal is, but the end goal is far. I think one of the grand challenges that we talk about school social work is ending homelessness. Well, we might want to end homelessness by tomorrow. At the end of the day, that's not super realistic. So how do we continue fighting for these big challenges and these end goals while also dealing with the now? Either one of you guys can hop in.
Okay, I'll give this one a try, because I think that, there are things, people have urgent needs now that we do need to respond to. And there are systems and structures that we have to be like committed to dismantling and changing, which is more long-term work. And I think a difficulty is if maybe we're too focused in the now, then we end up delinking, maybe something that we're doing today with this broader vision. And so I'll give an example from banking and financing again. I think we have a lot of social workers who end up working in financial coaching and financial capability, helping people to build their credit score, to be able to qualify for a mortgage, to be able to build wealth and intergenerational wealth, that, the banking system and the housing and real estate have, excluded people from for a long time in racist and sexist ways. And so people in the moment, right, need to be able to improve their credit score, to be able to function within the capitalist economy that we have, because there are real things at stake. Tying your credit score now more often to hiring decisions, and to housing decisions, to be able to rent an apartment, let alone, getting an emergency loan for a car repair or something like that. Credit score is built into all these things. So it's really sort of urgent today to be able to improve your credit score. Sometimes we call that, something like we're solving poverty, or we're solving racist discrimination in the banking system, or because funding and philanthropy sometimes requires us to write grants to be able to get money for these programs, and they posit it under a frame of like, racial healing or anti-poverty, then that becomes the language that we wrap around something that is like a financial coaching program to improve a person's credit score, which doesn't make that work any less meaningful. It still is important work to help somebody improve their credit score to be able to navigate the economy that we have. And that is really different than, working on a long-term strategy to dismantle racism in banking and lending. We call it that sometimes, but I think our language confuses us in terms of what level of scale that we're working on. That we are, working on an individual level, which remains important work, but we have to see that as connected to work that is, really taking aim at root causes over a longer period of time. And is that work, a stepping stone to help us to dismantle some of those systems and to build new ones? And so, that's what I would kind of say about like the urgency and the long-term strategies, that we have to make sure that they're linked together in a way that is, real. Yeah.
I would, to build on what Terri has said here, I would add the piece about things didn't get the way that they are now overnight. We've gotten to where we're at with a lot of the injustices that we see because of, a long period of time. So it's going to take a long time too to reverse that or move us in a better direction. So I think it's important too to think about benchmarks or points along the way where you can see successes and can see some movement in many of the things that we're working towards. To take it back to the original part of the question about the grand challenges or that piece of it, the grand challenges are huge. That's why they're grand, but they're big things for the whole field to be working on. And frequently when I think about social work and social work's role in trying to address the injustices facing our society, I like to think of it as we all have a part of the room we can clean up. Like I can work on my space over here on things and have to have some trust that there are other people in the field that are working on the problems that are in the other parts of the giant room. Because there's no way for any one of us to take on all of it. We all have different expertise and varying levels of time to commit to the work. So the way that I try to feel energized and stay positive about a lot of this work is to think that I'm working on this set of things, and I know that there were a lot of other social workers working on those same set of things too, but also some of the other ones. So it's not on me to necessarily try to worry about every single one of them, because then, if your attention is divided in that way, you're not going to be as successful. To Terri's other point about trying to link between addressing urgent or emergent needs and bigger systems change, I think that's really critical. And an example I would give where I've seen this play out, where I thought, so one thing I always like to talk about is that in Washtenaw County, we've been able to launch a children's savings account program where all kids in Washtenaw County public schools will get a savings account for college, trade school, or any kind of post-secondary education. And we really wanted equity to be at the focus of it. So if you're a kid that gets free or reduced lunch, you get a $500 seed to the accounts from the county. So this is something I had been working on with the county since before I got elected, and then was able to bring it to the finish line, largely as a result of the American Rescue Plan dollars that the county received. So in trying to champion that effort and to talk about it to community, most people loved it. Most people love this idea of giving kids savings accounts for college. I did have a couple of constituents call and say things like, you better not be planning to vote yes to give that money to them kids. I called that person back just to say, what are you thinking here? Not only am I voting yes, it's also my program. So yeah, I'm going to vote yes. But there was other concern that I heard around, hey, this is great. and maybe it will do the things that you're talking about, like promoting generational change and advancing communities a generation from now. But what about X, Y, and Z that's happening right now? And obviously, like, the county is working on like a number of things at the same time. But I think the lesson I learned from that, from a messaging perspective, was that it wasn't enough to talk about, hey, I know that we're experiencing a housing and homelessness crisis right now, and I know that there are all these other economic challenges, and I am working on them. But look at this children's savings account program, right? So from then on, I try to talk more broadly about like a package of things. So when I talk about the children's savings account program, I also talk about us launching a financial empowerment center, so anybody in Washtenaw County can get free financial counseling and support in paying back debt that they might owe. So I think it's important to be able to connect both of those things so people can see that I can be supportive of a policy that might not fix an immediate challenge, because an immediate challenge is also being addressed.
Thank you very much.
And do you mind if I add
Go
on
ahead.
to that? Because I think part of what Justin's talking about too is that there's like awareness raising and like critical consciousness building in these efforts as well, right? So you can learn about how, at a financial empowerment center, like the process of improving your credit score, but also like how the system is built and structured. And that's something that you didn't know about before. And now you have this tool, and that also builds sort of like awareness among people that could be used for organizing and advocacy in other spaces, like in the future, right? It's part of helping people sort of get to a learning point in, whatever it is. Maybe it's about housing, or maybe it's about savings accounts, or maybe it's about credit, but that also recognizing those things as possible, like learning activities.
Thank you very much. I think I do want to add to this because I know I've told Justin one of my I think biggest takeaways currently while being in the policy and political pathway, having experience in like policy and political social work already. One of my biggest takeaways is meeting other social workers, clinical or macro, that have stake and passion within political advocacy. Because I think while we are not in a perfect place with all the schools of social work, of like, as we talked about earlier, of like trying to build in and really tie the code of ethics into like every piece of the code of ethics into the school social work. While we're still developing and working on that, there's still other social workers that are there, or students that are coming to be professionals that have these ambitions and passions about policy and political, and being able to coalition build already. I think will help us in the future when we talk about linking these issues, because not all of us have the same passion specifically on topics, but the greater passion of these grand challenges is there. So we're able to better link all these things. So I think another, as we've talked about, I think all today, like, it's a very interconnected system, and, one thing happening is a very big butterfly effect happens all the time. So, you guys working in overall in your social work field, but also being professors and being able to instill passion and teaching, whether if it's about what a township is, or whether like what, teaching about credit and like racial banking. I think it's important of like really acknowledging how that can affect students and build to the next generation. And for all the practitioners and people that are field supervisors, being just that role of having conversations with your field students, or with younger professionals, students who may be interested in social work or are in social work, having those simple conversations can really help build coalitions and help us in the future as we continue to fight for social justice as well. I do also want to mention and do want to start plugging, as we are closer to the end of this webinar, a lot more of next steps, because I think the reality is that we can have conversations, but we talk about praxis. It's more than just conversation. It's about then actions with it. So as earlier, we've discussed a lot of things to do. If you look on NSW, there's a lot of MPACE. There is the Legislative Social Policy Committee. There is the Social Justice and Anti-Racism Committee. There's a lot of committees that NSW has throughout the month. As we talk, even there's the LGBTQ plus community that you can learn more about the specific policies affecting them and their community. So I think it's I suggest as an NSW member, you take part in those if you have the time. I also want to plug. I was there Wednesday night, this past Wednesday. If you're in Washtenaw County, going to the Board of Commissioners meeting, I think if you're close to wherever your Board of Commissioners meeting takes place, go in person, and because there's usually something. There's always a public comment about something. There's always something that's going to be affecting you. I need to go and talk about the roads to the Washtenaw board because it's frustrating every single time driving. But I do want to open the floor to both of you if you have any recommendations of ways to get involved.
I'll start on this one. So I'd say, as much as I love the plug to come to my Washtenaw County Board of Commissioners meetings, I'd say come to those, but also look at your city and township governments. Go to those as well, because just the way that we have government in Michigan, city and township governments do certain things that county government doesn't do, and vice versa. So just make sure you know what's going on in your local community. Follow your local news as best you can. That's really challenging with really the news drought that we have, but I'd say follow Michigan radio and your local NPR station. So if you're in Washtenaw County or nearby, WEMU does more local and county related news. It's a big election year, so I'd say volunteer on a campaign. It's a great way to get a ton of experience, and not just like for the presidential campaigns, but there's a lot of things on the ballot. So look at your city and township and your county races and figure out what kinds of things you're really passionate about and find some of those to volunteer on. I'd say sign up to be a poll worker. It's going to be, particularly with the changes in election laws, which I believe is the next topic in this series. Local clerks need as much support as they can get. In Michigan, we have a decentralized election system, so it's really on city and township clerks, and then with support from the county clerk to get a lot of that to make elections work. And all of us, it's a collaborative activity to do all of that. So I'd say volunteer to do that. Make sure you're registered to vote. I mean, that's bare minimum there. Make sure you're registered to vote and help other people register to vote. That's a good set of things. Do all of those.
And I suppose I'll add, join an organization. So, find something that you're interested in committing to, commit to it, and, make that be your work. And it's helpful to know, right, that our issues are interlinked. So if you're interested in environmental justice, if you're interested in tech and surveillance, if you're interested in racial justice, economic justice, social justice, LGBTQ issues, that all of those, right, are interlinked. So you as an individual might not be able to spread your time across 5 or 7 organizations on each of those independent issues, but committing to something, joining with others, and working on an issue that you care about is going to be, in service of moving justice forward, across all these other areas. And so that's what I would add to the great list that Justin already gave, is to join and be involved, because I think some of the things that, we're facing, not just policy-wise, but society-wise, necessitates that we are involved in advocating.
Thank you. I think there's also a good amount of people who've plugged a bunch of groups in the chat, so feel free to look at that. Also, I feel like it wouldn't be a really social work webinar if I don't ask about this, because sometimes even as a student I struggle with. So I do want to ask, as macro social workers and as social workers, how do you practice self-care and making sure, because I think myself as a macro, we talk about these grand challenges and how, we can be isolated, we can feel imposter syndrome, we can feel weighed down by even failure. how do we make sure that we're taking care of ourselves so we can, make sure we're doing good work as well.
Well, I'll say I think care, just like organizing and advocacy, is collective. And so I have a great group of people who I help take care of, and they help take care of me. And that knowing that I'm not alone in some of the work that I do is really helpful. And I don't, I take time off and I take time away, and I take time to do the things that are important and energizing to me, which seems, maybe a little bit obvious, but taking time off and being involved in care and collective and community is how I approach it and think about it.
Yeah, I'd say that's how I would have to look at it too. I would just say you're involved in a lot of things. You have to have good time management and boundaries, and to know when to say no to certain things, and figure out ways to build into your schedule time to make sure that you're taking care of yourself. But doing this work in a community is really essential. It's one of the key ways, I think, to avoid burnout, because, as Terri just said, you're supporting others and others are supporting you, because none of this can be done alone.
Thank you. And I think it'd also be unfair if I didn't answer as well. I found myself continually fighting to improve my self-care. So as you guys said, I would agree. Having friends and fellow activists around you, where you have those shared experiences where you can vent to each other and discuss problems and the nuisances that you found in life, and kind of get it off your chest. I also find myself really, I moved into meditating and journaling to really make sure I'm able to, center myself and get all my thoughts and ideas down. Because I think a lot of us as social workers, a lot of analogy I use a lot is we have a pot that's boiling and you keep the lid on. Like you eventually have to let the lid off and let the steam before, we all know. I think we've all cooked before. It's happened a lot to me a couple times where the pot boils over, literally, where it's a big mess and you don't want that. It's always letting out the steam, whether that's talking to a friend or an organizer, or even just writing down your thoughts. I think there's some other comments on the chat about practicing self-compassion. So I think we mentioned earlier about this idea of failing, also like giving ourselves spaces to kind of come down from that failure and recognize that we're trying our best and the world's not relying on us, while we not the fate of the world's not on all of our is not on our shoulders. It's a collective effort, and knowing that, I think, helps a lot. And do again, then I want to comment another comment that was talked about being politically active. Susan mentioned that sometimes if you do not have the time to give, if you have the money, these organizations do run. I know MPACE has their fund that can be donated to campaigns. So I think it's another important thing, that actively giving money to a campaign or an organization that you support is a way of political advocacy and being active. I think that's very important to mention, because as we've talked about, with a lot of people, their first thoughts are, holding the banner, being out there. But if you don't have the time, the space, or the ability to do so, giving that money goes a long way in those campaigns and these organizations that tend to, a lot of social work organizations, running a student org myself, there's not a lot of money to go around. So any type of donation and money goes a long way with these orgs. So I do, again, want to thank you. And as we talked about a lot of like what elections and poll workers, I do want to plug May 10th. It'll be the same time, 10:30 to 12. We will be talking about election laws and deadlines, as maybe we get a little preview. I know Justin's very familiar with the new election laws. Do you want to maybe speak to that a little bit?
Well, I just say we'll talk about how the impact of the 9 days of early voting will have on voting. We've seen a little bit of that with the presidential primary, but I think it'll really be significant for the primary in August and the general election in November. We'll talk about how do you become a poll worker, and really touching on much of what we talked about today.
Thank you very much. Again, do want to plug Capital Action Day. get some real life hands-on advocacy experience in the Capitol and experience Lansing. Here it's beautiful. And then just going on to really push forward in your calendars and look ahead. We do have LEAD in October, which obviously is our Legislative Education and Advocacy Day, where we'll discuss some of the topics talked about today, but also we'll be able to talk about more specific topics that about policy. As last year we talked about child welfare, we talked about healthcare, we also talked about AI growing in policy and social work. It's all important things. I do want to give you guys a last chance as we wrap up. If you have anything else you want to add before we are done here.
Join NASW and get involved with one of their many committees. Those are really fantastic committees, and it's a great way to stay up to date on all the things that are going on in the state.
And just a note to say that I appreciate all the work that you are probably already doing around organizing and advocacy, and to look forward to seeing you in different spaces where that work is happening.
And thank you to our panelists here. I think it's an important thing to being in this election year, working around advocacy and working around as we talked about a lot today, social justice and fighting oppression, fighting against oppressive systems as this constant fight, and we'll see it played out through all this year. Hopefully, I hope we can all join together in collective action to see wins across the state and wins across hopefully the nation as well. So thank you all again for joining and have a blessed Friday.